Shabbat Shalom! Today's portion is called Vayigash, which means he drew near or he approached, and this is referring to Judah walking closer to Joseph. There are many layers of meaning to this phrase according to the Jewish sages and rabbis. On one level, it implies an approach to battle. It's also used in this way in 2 Samuel chapter 10, verse 13, when Joab goes to battle. It also implies coming near to make somebody less angry, like when the children of Judah approached Joshua in Joshua 14:6. It can also mean coming near to pray or plead, like in 1 Kings 18:36. And of course, it can just simply mean physically coming near someone. There was one rabbi who said, in Judah's case, where it says Vayigash, it means all of these, because Judah was ready for whatever was going to happen. He didn't know how Joseph was going to react, so he was prepared. Now we're going to do a quick summary of this week's portion in case any of you didn't read it. I, of course, encourage you to read it, but if you didn't or you've already forgotten what has happened, we're going to do a quick recap right now. Let's start a little bit before this portion begins, just to give some context. We know that Egypt is currently in a season of famine because God warned Pharaoh that this would happen in a dream. There was that dream that nobody could interpret except for Joseph, who is in a prison. So Joseph is lifted up out of prison and brought before Pharaoh, and he's able to interpret Pharaoh's dream and even offer a solution to this 7 years of famine problem. And Pharaoh, of course, is very impressed. So Pharaoh immediately lifts Joseph up into this position of authority. He's now second in command, second only to Pharaoh. And he's able to provide food for all the people during the time of the famine. And it's during this time of famine that what should happen, but Joseph looks up and it's his brothers. They have come to Egypt to get food as well, because the famine has also affected Canaan. Now, obviously, Joseph has some feelings about this, seeing the people who sold him into slavery before him, bowing before him like they did in his dream many, many years ago. So he tests them. He tests them very creatively. He wants to see if they've changed. So it's a purposeful testing. There's a reason to it. He's not just being mean. He also takes the opportunity to ask after their father and questions them about Benjamin, saying like, hey, next time you come back, maybe bring that little younger brother of yours. And of course, because the famine is so long, the brothers do have to come back, and of course they come back bringing Benjamin. And Joseph has his silver cup hidden in Benjamin's bag, so just as they're about to leave and go back to Canaan, Joseph's people catch up to them and say, one of you has stolen our master's cup. So all the bags are searched, and the culprit is supposed to be brought back to Egypt to become a slave. And everyone is surprised, including Benjamin, obviously, to find Joseph's cup in his bag. So Benjamin is obviously taken away, but it's interesting to note that all of the brothers went with him. So everybody is now back in Egypt and back in front of Joseph. And that's where we're going to begin our portion today in Vayigash. So our portion today begins with Judah interceding for Benjamin before Joseph. He steps forward out of all of the brothers. So right away, he's showing himself that he is the de facto leader. He's almost in the role of the firstborn, which would belong to Reuben, except Reuben made kind of a mistake. And we know that this action of him stepping forward and speaking up on behalf of everyone else is a foreshadowing of the blessing that his father will give him later about the line of kings that will come from him. Reading what Judah says to Joseph here is always a very moving experience for me. It paints a very heart-rending portrait of an old, ailing father who will definitely die if he loses another beloved son, having lost that son's brother already many years ago. Obviously, Judah doesn't mention any of the details as to how that original favorite brother was lost, but we see that whatever happened many years ago clearly affected Judah enough that he does not want to see his father go through that again, go through that pain, go through that grief. So he does a very selfless thing. He offers himself in Benjamin's place. This again shows his change, even as he is still in a very leadership position. Remember, he was the one many years ago who suggested that they sell Joseph. Except for Reuben, everyone was considering just killing Joseph, but Judah was like, hey, we can make some money on this. What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? This is Genesis 37. Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. His brothers agreed. Even then, Judah was in a very much of a leadership position. And again, he is in that same position now. But there's a difference. He's not going, okay, yeah, you can take Benjamin. He takes all our dad's attention anyway. But he instead offers himself to be the slave that is supposed to be the fate of Benjamin in this scenario. We see that he's been through a lot. We do get a lot more detail about Judah's life in previous portions. So we know that he has definitely seen the consequences of his actions before. And he doesn't take this time to make any excuses. He doesn't say, Benjamin's innocent. He just simply emphasizes that he cannot cause his father this pain again, because it will kill him. We can also see the change in the other brothers, some more than others, of course, and maybe not as obvious as in Judah. They did come back with Benjamin. They didn't leave him behind and just go, well, okay, good luck in Egypt, and then go back to Canaan. They also didn't seem to resent him being favored by Joseph earlier. They stuck together, and they were all probably concerned about their father, and they all continued to humble themselves before Joseph. And as mentioned last week, they were very aware that it was possible that their current situation was due to their sin against Joseph many years ago. Now Joseph, along with us as the reader, were moved by Judah's words. He sends everyone away, and he starts weeping. He weeps so loudly that it says Pharaoh's household heard, Egyptians heard, everyone has heard, like, wow, our second in command, he is weeping. And then it says Joseph revealed himself to his brothers. Some scholars say this is a literal action that he took by showing them that he was circumcised, which the ancient Egyptians would not have been, and also by speaking in their native tongue. His brothers are shocked into silence. They can't process it. The rabbis even say that in that moment, their souls actually left their bodies in their shock and had to be brought back with a miracle from God. Now, it's important to read what Joseph does here, and it's one of my favorite moments in the Bible, if I'm being honest. But Joseph acknowledges, obviously, that while he definitely knows that what they did was wrong, and it isn't like he lost his memory and forgot what they did to him, he says that it is God who has brought him to Egypt, who sent him ahead of them to save all of their lives. He gives glory to God. He tells them to bring Jacob and the rest of the family to Egypt, to hurry and do this quickly, and he will take care of all of them. Obviously, there's a reunion. There's weeping, there's talking, probably a lot of talking. There's 20 plus years to catch up on at this point. And Pharaoh, obviously having figured out what has happened by this point, he probably sent somebody right away to find out what has happened. He's really excited by this. Joseph's family is here. And he encourages, or rather it says orders, Joseph's whole family to come to live in Egypt, saying that we'll give you the best part of the land. You'll have nothing to worry about. He's close to Joseph, so probably he also doesn't want this very useful person to leave, which is perhaps a possibility. You know, it's a lot easier for somebody without family far away to stay with you. So he's like, no, don't go there. Just bring them all here. So, bearing lots of gifts and wagons, the brothers go back to Canaan. There's new clothes, extra clothes for Benjamin, silver for Benjamin. There's 10 donkeys with the finest Egyptian goods, and there's food for Jacob to eat on the return journey. Jacob doesn't believe this at first. Some people say, like, they don't blame him. It is kind of interesting, though, that the last time all the brothers gathered together to tell Jacob something, was when they told him, oh, we found this coat. Does it belong to your son? If it's Joseph's, maybe he was killed by animals, and Jacob believed them at that point and tore his clothes and wept. In this moment where they're like, Joseph is alive, he's in Egypt, Jacob's reaction is, I don't believe you, you're lying. He doesn't believe them until he sees the wagons, until he sees all the gifts, and he gets the details of everything that happens. And the Bible says his spirit begins to revive, which is a beautiful way of saying this old man just coming to life. And he says, we have to go. We must go to Joseph, and we must go now. It's a beautiful moment because in Genesis 42:36, Jacob is in a very low place. Obviously, ever since he lost Rachel, and then ever since he lost Joseph, he's not been in the greatest place in his life. He says in Genesis 42, everything is against me. But now in Genesis 45, after he has heard that his beloved son is actually alive, his mind shifts and he says, it is enough. It is enough. Let's go. So Jacob takes everything he owns with him, all the people, all the things, and they head out for Egypt. But first, they stop at Beersheba. Joseph had told him to hurry and not delay, but this is a very important stop, especially for somebody like Jacob, who has been on such a dramatic journey with God his entire life. Jacob stops at Beersheba, he sacrifices to God, and there God meets him. God comes to him in the night, and he calls to Jacob. He calls himself the God of your father Isaac. He tells him not to be afraid and reassures him that this is the right decision. It's the right thing to do to go down to Egypt. Some scholars say when God tells Jacob not to be afraid, there's probably an understanding there that Jacob is very familiar with what has happened in his family before. Like Abraham didn't have the greatest of experiences when he went to Egypt. Isaac was specifically instructed not to go in Egypt and to stay in Canaan. So Jacob must have had quite a struggle within him, whether or not this was the right thing to do, even though he wanted to see his son so badly. But we have God here reassuring him that, yes, this is what I want you to do. And as we study this moment and we look at God's words to Jacob, it's an interesting parallel with the last time Jacob left Canaan. The last time Jacob left Canaan was when he was running from his brother Esau and also, going to find a wife as a secondary mission in Genesis 28. Both times God identifies himself as the God of his fathers. In this case, Isaac, earlier of Isaac and of Abraham. And God says over and over again, I will, and then do something. And in both instances, we have a reiteration of the promise that God made with Abraham, that you are going to become a great nation with many descendants. They're going to be like the stars in the sky. And it's said again, this reminder of this important covenant. And in both times, God also says to Jacob that he will be with him wherever he goes, even if it is far away from this promised land. Because in both times, Jacob was not staying in the promised land. He was actually on his way out. And that doesn't deter God at all, obviously. God says, I will be with you wherever you go, even if it's far away. And if it is far away, if it's outside of the promised land, don't worry, I will bring you back. So with God and God's blessing, very important, everything and everyone heads down to Egypt. Once they get closer, Judah is sent ahead by Jacob to guide them to Goshen, where Joseph meets them. There's another joyful and tearful reunion. Jacob again says, I can now die. I have seen my son. Joseph tells them what to say because he's going to present some of them, not all of them, to Pharaoh. So he tells them, you know what, the Egyptians, they don't really like shepherds, so maybe instead of saying you're shepherds, you can just say you are keepers of livestock. But I guess the brothers are in kind of an honest move. They've just been through this great spiritual awakening of sorts. So they very plainly tell Pharaoh they're shepherds. And you know what? Pharaoh honors them anyway, gives them the best land, and he does all this for Joseph's sake. even saying like, hey, if you're good at what you do, I will let you take care of my flocks. Then we have a very interesting moment where Jacob goes before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh, of all the things to ask and say, he wants to know how old Jacob is. When I read this, my first instinct was, wait, is Pharaoh a child? Because I feel like that's a very childlike thing to ask, to meet a new person and be like, how old are you? But Jacob answers, and he answers in a very unique way. He says he's 130, but then he kind of goes down a very dark path where he's like, my years have been few and difficult compared to that of my ancestors. And he very specifically calls his time and that of his father's a pilgrimage, his stay on this earth, or a pilgrimage. In Hebrew, it's magur, which has a sense of the temporary, like we're just passing through. This is not our final eternal destination, and more on that later, but this is an important mindset to have, I feel, about our lives here on earth. Some of the Jewish rabbis have explained Jacob's less than glowing description of his life as a reflection of his understanding and analysis of his time on earth. He's had plenty of time to think. And this is the conclusion that he's come to. This is connected with the Jewish idea of tikkun olam, which is the sense that once sin entered the world was kind of broken. And it's part of the mission of Israel and God's people to repair the world. This can be through action, like charity, like helping others, like building up things, or through teaching God's word, teaching the Torah. And the idea is that as you repair the world with God, that eventually when it's a lot better, the Messiah will come, and then God's kingdom will come. So the rabbis look at Jacob's reaction in the terms of tikkun olam, saying that Jacob probably looked at his life, and in comparison to what Abraham and Isaac were able to accomplish during their times on earth, he probably felt like he didn't do as much as they did. And in a sense, it may look that way, but that's hardly true at all. Jacob, as we know, his name is also Israel, and it becomes synonymous with this great nation that God is building through him. This great nation was promised to Abraham, to Isaac, but they only had one son through which the line went. And now we have Jacob, and he's got 12 sons. And everything with Jacob in his life is a beginning. So there's a lot of things that he put effort into, or he got started, but they're just starting. They're still awaiting realization. They haven't come to their full fruition. They're beginning the process. So if you look at your life in that sense, like, oh, God's having me start a bunch of things, but I'm not going to be able to see them all fulfilled, it can feel like, then what have I accomplished? But it's important to know that in God's eyes, you've accomplished exactly what he's called you to do, exactly what he has put on your life to do, that this was your part of the process to do, and you did it. So Jacob, in any case, that's his answer to Pharaoh, and then he does a very interesting thing by blessing Pharaoh. Remember, pharaohs in ancient Egypt were seen as a god in their culture, so it is a very interesting move that Jacob does to bless him. And then, as far as we know, Jacob just leaves. It doesn't seem like Pharaoh dismisses him or says, you can go now. Jacob just goes, which gives the reader the impression that, okay, Jacob is acknowledging that Pharaoh is just a man. Like, there's only one God, God of the universe, and then the rest of us we're people. After this meeting, Joseph's family gets settled in, and Joseph becomes their provider, and he provides for them very well. They're in the best land. They have more than enough food. They have places to raise their animals and grow. In the rest of the land, obviously, the famine is continuing, and it's getting more severe, and Joseph is trying to balance feeding everybody while also maintaining a fair system of payment and then later a system of taxation. The people pay first with money. Once they run out of money, they're paying with animals and then their land, and eventually they're even willing to be slaves. Because honestly, what's the point of not being a slave if I guess you're going to starve to death? So Joseph sets up this system of taxation where once the people plant fields and they're able to get a harvest, 20% of that harvest will go to Pharaoh. It's probably quite reasonable in the scheme of things. In any sense, the Egyptian people were willing and happy about this because in their eyes, Joseph saved their life. 7 years of famine is enough to topple any country, any empire. So Joseph saved them, and they were perfectly willing to do all that he asked and agree to all that he asked. This is an interesting contrast with the beginning of Exodus, where we have a new Pharaoh who doesn't know Joseph and doesn't remember this. Like, what famine? What Joseph? I don't know. And we have a flipping of the tables because now the Egyptian people, they are not offering to be Pharaoh's slaves, but instead they are enslaving Joseph's family. So we've seen this kind of thing before. You're very grateful in the bad times for the help, but once the good times come around, you forget. And that's, I suppose, nothing new. It's a little bit human nature, but God can use it for his glory. That's a future portion. The end of our portion today talks about how Israel's time in Goshen is going. It's going very well. They're very productive. They're growing wealthy. They've multiplied in number, and they're enjoying the best land in Egypt. It's almost an interesting direct contrast to what is going on everywhere else in Egypt with the famine, which is probably why they're placed right next to each other in this text. It does make me wonder a little bit if maybe some of the bitterness and resentment of the people saying like, wow, those strangers sure are living a good life over there, carries on to future generations and perhaps informed how they are treated later on in Exodus. Before we move on, I want to very quickly look at one specific phrase in this particular section of our portion. There's a phrase in English is had possessions in it, or they took possession of it. Talking about Israel and Goshen, and it literally means in Hebrew that they took hold of it. But the sages have also translated it as they were held by it. This is significant because they are both ways that Jewish people view the state of exile, basically. Their time in Egypt, after all, was a kind of exile. It's a time away from the promised land, away from Canaan. Now, that's not to say that their time in exile may not be a good one. It may be good. They may even flourish, as they did for a while in Goshen. And in this case, we know that God was the one who brought them there. But it's still a space that can hinder their connection with God and the mission they feel that God has given them, and may even affect them spiritually. After all, wherever they are, there's always a danger that if it's not among your own people and you're surrounded by a lot of idol-worshipping nations, that there may be some assimilation. So this place that they are in has two meanings and two purposes in this story. In one sense, it is a holding place to develop them. They enter as 70 plus people into this land, and God tells Jacob that it's here, in this land, in Egypt, where I'm going to make you a great nation. And we know Abraham was told that this whole thing would happen in Genesis 15. So Goshen becomes this place where Israel can grow as a nation and also stay separate. Perhaps in contrast to if they had stayed in Canaan, we know that there have been a lot of close calls regarding blending in and intermarrying with the groups of people that are already there. So they're less likely in some sense to do that in Egypt because, again, the Egyptians are not into shepherds and seem to be a little bit prejudiced against Hebrew people in general. So on one sense, it is a safe place where they will be able to survive the famine and prosper, but it's also a holding place in the sense of being a prison where you will need to escape from it eventually. But the key point that we get from this is that it is temporary. It isn't their final destination. God isn't bringing them to Egypt and being like, this is your new promised land. But their time in Egypt is still meaningful. There's a purpose there. And it's on purpose. After all, God is the one who confirms to Jacob that, yes, this is the right decision. Go to Egypt. So God brings them there. Whenever I think about this, it always reminds me of this pastor who talked about some of the misconceptions people may have about God leading them. Not to say that God isn't able to lead somebody in a certain way, but a lot of us think or hope that when God leads us, it's going to be like point A, and then ta-da, point B. You have steps 1, 2, and 3 in there, and then everything is orderly and nice, and you know when you're going to get there, and you get there, and it's great. But oftentimes, he said it's more like point A, and then point D, and then point -2, and then you're back to point A again, and then who knows at what point will you get to where actually you're supposed to be going. My personal walk with God has perhaps often felt more like that, and maybe it felt like that for Jacob in that moment. After all, the promise is, I will make you a great nation, this is your promised land, and you're already there. You're already in Canaan. So this seems like a logical, okay, so I'm in Canaan. I'm in this promised land. I'm going to become a great nation here. But no, now we're going to leave the promised land and go to Egypt. But in some sense, that kind of feels like you're going backwards. But it is encouraging to us to remember that no matter how or where God leads you, even if where you are is an unfortunate result of you messing up somewhere, if you walk with him with a repentant heart, every moment of action or inaction or just waiting has purpose, even if you can't tell in that moment. And remember, the heart of this is that God is with them. And he said so very clearly, directly to Jacob. That brings us to our key point. The key thing that we want to take away from today is God's relationship with his people and with what they are going through. Some of you may know this. I've taught children and teenagers for many years, and this is one of the foundational lessons we teach them. Probably if you have children or were a child in the church, you're very familiar with the words, Jesus loves you and God is with you all the time. Like that very famous song that everyone probably knows. Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Little ones to him belong, they are weak, but he is strong. There's actually a fourth verse to that song, and it's always interesting to me that the song wasn't necessarily originally meant for children. It was just a hymn, but we use it most often with children. We're less likely to hear it in the adult services. But the fourth verse goes, Jesus loves me, he will stay close beside me all the way. Thou hast bled and died for me, I will henceforth live for thee. Now these are very familiar lessons to us. Again, you hear them a lot with children. Even non-believers have probably heard this before. So it's not anything new. But sometimes as we get older and life gets more complicated, we kind of forget. Not in the sense of like it's out of our memory, but it's perhaps not something we dwell on very often or even think about and chew on as much as we might need to get through life. In fact, a lot of times as we get older, we stop thinking in terms of God is with me all the time and using that as comfort. And instead, we try to put God into specific areas of our life. We start saying, okay, we can meet with God. Sunday is good, Saturday is good, maybe Wednesday, Friday night. And it's kind of funny in a sad way because it's almost like we're trying to fit the God of the universe into our schedules and our understanding. And then the thought process we have is that's God's time and the rest of the time is my time to do what I need to do. We only think about God or actively seek him or cry out to him when we need something or when we're not happy with where we are or what's happening. And sometimes if things get really difficult, we start wondering, where are you? Where are you, God? These lessons are very simple, so simple we teach them to children. But it's actually something a lot of us struggle with, and we need to be reminded of. We see in today's Torah portion that God is with his people, and we are also among his people, and God is with us as well. And he is with us whether we're in a promised land situation or if we're in an Egypt situation. And he is with us by his own word, he has said so, and by his own choice. In Matthew 28:20, before Yeshua ascends to heaven, he says, remember, I will be with you always. Yes, even until the end of the age. And for me, that's always a very moving reminder that the children of Israel didn't go into Egypt alone, and they didn't leave Egypt alone. And that is the difference when you walk with God. But it's important to know this is not supposed to be a one-sided relationship. We can't just go, oh, God is with me, I'll just sit back and relax and it's fine. You have to also make an effort to be present with God. You have to allow him to work in you and through you, whatever situation you are in, to make him an active, consistent part of your life in every level and to really foster a close relationship with him. A lot of times we look at Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, or David, and all these big names in the Bible, and we think like, wow, God talked to them, God spoke to them, God led them personally. That's amazing. I could never have that. And you can, though. That's the truth of it. They had that relationship with God because they were actively working on it. God was a real and present part of every aspect of their life, and they maintained that relationship with him. And if you did the same, you too could have that experience that they had with God. God choosing those people, God leading those people and making them promises. None of that's an accident. It was because he wanted to, and it was in response to their faith and the heart that they had for God. I'm not saying that they were perfect, because, oh my goodness, they were not. And I'm not saying their lives were easy, because if you look at what we know about their lives in the Bible, it wasn't. But the way they saw God and the way they let that affect how they saw the situation they were in and just how they knew God, that made a huge difference. Your relationship with God should form the context, the foundation of all you are and all you do. When we look at this story this week and the Torah portions that came before and after, we can see the spiritual growth in Jacob or Judah or Joseph, that even in their little pilgrimage on earth, this brief moment of time, they grew spiritually with God and in God. This isn't just only through the good situations or the good choices, but it's also through the bad ones and the bad choices. All of that in the hands of God and through our human repentance and seeking and faith, clinging to him. That changes not only them and their descendants and their destiny, but that can also be the case for us. And that's the biggest lesson of all, that if God is with you and in you, there should be change. He should change you. It should change you. His words should change you. And that change doesn't just stop in you. It will change everything around you, your relationships with people, the situations that you're in. You will be less selfish and more selfless. You won't let your anger or bitterness consume you, but you will choose reconciliation and forgiveness. You will also acknowledge God's hesed, or kindness and grace. In the Jewish way of thinking, God gives you specifically in this season, what you need. No more, no less. What is yours. And anything beyond that is kindness and grace and blessing. So there's no room for resentment or bitterness, thinking you deserved something and you didn't get it. Because honestly, that kind of mindset is going to poison you and also your relationship with others if you think other people owe you something. Think of Joseph's brothers and their jealousy. They were so jealous of Joseph, thinking that all that he was getting should belong to them as well, that they were willing to kill him at one point, and then even agreed to sell him into slavery and lie to their dad about it. The truth is, it is all God's grace, the very breath in your lungs. I love that the Jewish people, in the morning, the first thing they do is they sing a prayer. And this prayer is just literally thanking God for giving them their breath back, for letting them wake up and have a new opportunity, a new day, for restoring their life to them. And honestly, we should be thankful that we don't get what we deserve, because technically, because we are sinners and we sin like this, what we deserve is the consequence of sin, which is death. But we don't get that if we choose him. And also, we don't have to face the burden of trying to earn our salvation, because, again, none of us are worthy. Joseph's treatment of his brothers in this Torah portion is a great representation of this hesed. Obviously, a lot of you are probably saying that's easier said than done. And yeah, in a sense it is, because these are not lessons that are learned overnight. In fact, if you look at the people in our Torah portion today, they're not lessons that they learned instantly, but they're a product of their relationship with God and walking through all the ups and downs of life with God and seeking to be with him. And it's also the result of having the right understanding and the proper context and purpose for our lives here on earth. Joseph's brothers wronged him. They knew it. He knew it. God knew it. Joseph didn't try to sugarcoat it or excuse it like, oh, you didn't know any better. But he looked at it in the context of something greater, of God's plan. He could see God's hand moving in the mess, and in the greater context of God and his purpose, the little workings of men and humans matters very little. And because Joseph has this understanding, he is able to say this to his brothers, that it is God who has brought me here. But he wouldn't have been able to know that earlier. When he was first sold into slavery in Egypt, he wouldn't have known that God would eventually lead him to become second in command in Egypt. All he would have known was, I'm a slave now in Egypt. So for a long time, all Joseph had was faith and the promise that God was with him. And that was enough. Over and over it says in Joseph's time in Egypt, in multiple places, the Lord was with Joseph. And it didn't just affect his life, but other people noticed it too. So even if the big thing that God had promised or the big purpose that God had in mind hasn't happened yet, you can still see God leading you and working in you along the way. He was in Egypt because of his brothers, yes, but also because of God. God took something horrible and terrible and used it for his purpose. If you walk with God, you can have confidence in his plan, in his calling, even if it's not how you imagine it or in the timing you or the world around you would like. You can have faith that he is in control. And remember, not only is our relationship with God extremely important and we need to focus on it, how we deal with other people, especially within the body of Christ, is also important as well. Remember, Yeshua sums up the Torah and the prophets by saying, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. This is Matthew 22, 36 through 40. In an ideal situation, you wouldn't be able to separate these anyway. If you truly love God, the love of God in you is going to overflow. Because that's just how God's love works. And when it overflows, it's not just going to affect you, it's going to affect everybody else around you, especially your brothers and sisters in Yeshua. And we are reminded of this again in 1 John 4:20. Whoever claims to love God yet hates a brother or sister is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother and sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. This always makes me think, wow, that's serious. So we know that we are called to love others, but how do we love them? We love them with God's love. Not how we think they should be loved or how we would like to be loved, but we love them with God's love. So what is God's love? God's love is something so powerful and unique that in Romans chapter 5, it says that God loved us even when we were his enemies, even when we were lost in our sin. That doesn't mean he wants us to stay in our sin or remain his enemies, no. But in terms of having a relationship with us, he took a huge self-sacrificing first step by going on the cross and dying for us. We just need to reach out and take it and choose him and his plan over ourselves. Our relationship with God is number one. But if that doesn't change you to be more like Yeshua and inform and infect your relationship with others, then there might be a problem. Because in these commands, there's an implied action that is required from you. You don't just sit there and say, I love you, and then God yells down, I also love you, and you just receive it. But this is a love that needs action from you. And we see this very powerfully in this passage through the reconciliation and reunion of the brothers. This is a supernatural forgiveness. This is not a forgiveness that comes from the world or from man himself. Because honestly, no one would blame Joseph if he threw them all into jail and made them all slaves. Many would call it justice. They sold their brother. They wanted to kill him. Like, that's not good. And if Joseph wanted to have a little bit revenge, we'd be like, yeah, that sounds about right. And this isn't to say that there is no justice present here. It's just that the justice is now in God's hands. And as he is the perfect judge and the only one who can change our hearts, he is allowed to repay or show mercy as he wants. But this story is moving to anybody who reads it because of the fact that it is a picture of an undeserved love and an undeserved kindness and an undeserved forgiveness. Remember, Joseph is able to do this because he is looking at everything through that heavenly context. I'm sure previous speakers have brought up how Joseph is a type of Christ, a representation of Christ, an early foreshadowing. So this action should also remind us of what Yeshua did, of the grace and reconciliation that we have through our Messiah. Again, it's nothing we deserve. In fact, often we deserve the opposite. But it is because of God's grace and mercy and for his purpose. It's also a reminder that salvation, while free to us, came at great cost. That means we were purchased by the blood of Yeshua, and we belong to him. So this reconciliation is precious. It brings union between Joseph and his brothers, and it reflects a union we can now have with Yeshua, with God. We can also see reconciliation as a major theme in the Haftorah for this week too. Again, we have that division between the two kingdoms. We have the kingdom of Judah and then the kingdom of Israel, represented here through Joseph and Ephraim. Remember, the kingdom of Israel actually split after King Solomon passed because of succession issues, and it became two kingdoms. We had the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. So this passage and this prophecy have many layers. On one level, it is a literal reconciliation and reunion, that these two kingdoms will become one, echad. You may know that word from the Shema, Adonai echad, it means one. God is saying someday in the future, I'm going to bring these two kingdoms that were once one, but then split. I'm going to bring them back together. God's covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will come to fruition again. It will be an eternal covenant, and there will be reconciliation and reunion, and all that God promised will come true. So that's the surface level. We also have a Messianic prophecy here, where we get a glimpse into God's future kingdom here on earth. So we've got two Davids here, and they represent the two aspects of the Messiah when he comes back again. We have Messiah as a king who brings law and order by teaching people God's Torah, by leading them that way. And we also have Messiah as a servant of God. And that is what will change the world. Oftentimes we hear people wanting to change the world or be the change in the world that you want to see. But that is what will change the world. Yeshua will change the world with a covenant of peace. And again, we have in this passage God promising that he will be with his people. He will be with them. His home, his sanctuary will be with them. His word will guide them. And this is a constantly repeated promise. And I personally am always encouraged by God's promises, especially to Israel, because I just think like if God keeps his promises to Israel, I know he will keep his promises to me as well. This is also a very unique prophecy because the prophet Ezekiel is told to get a visual aid. Most prophecies seem to be just spoken. There are a few others that involve a visual aid, but it's not the most common thing. He has to get 2 sticks and write on them, and then they are brought together into a single stick. Many scholars reading this believe that this is God indicating that his words aren't only in the heavenly realm, but they've also been brought into the physical realm. So there's a physical example that people can look at. And this means that God's plans were already set into motion. It's a plan for the future. It's a plan for hope. It's a plan of reconciliation between God and his people and among his people. And this kind of reconciliation can only come from God by his grace, by his love in us, and by his word living in us that will result in the nations looking at this reconciliation, this love, this peace, and all the nations, it says, will know that he is God. And he promises that never again will there be division, because that division caused death, whether it's death of a relationship, death like in a literal sense, or spiritual death, emotional death. That division instead will give way to life and unity in God. When I think about the world recently with everything going on, it's kind of chaotic and messy. More so in recent years in some sense, but I know that's probably on some level always been the case. There's a lot of division. I live in America, so it's probably international news, all the division that we've had. And unfortunately, even within the church itself, the body of Yeshua, there is division as well. Not that it's perhaps anything new, but it is still heartbreaking to see. So I think it's important that all of us take this time that we have on earth seriously, but in the sense of, as Jacob puts it, it's just a little pilgrimage, a temporary stay. There's a song in English called like, "This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through." That's perhaps the mindset that we should have in this crazy, chaotic world. Don't put your heart here. In Matthew 6:21, it says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." So don't put your heart here. And don't let your life center around your earthly commitments and your human nature and desires. The things of the earth may seem extraordinarily important, and they want your attention. Now, I understand. I live here on earth as well. But just take a deep breath and remember what is really important. And above all, don't let bitterness and unforgiveness and resentment take root in you. That's only going to lead to more division and to pain. Forgive others even if they never say sorry. I know that's very hard. Otherwise, this burden that you carry will affect you more than the subject of your pain. And if you need to make something right, because just like we can think of times when we are hurt, we've probably hurt others as well. We need to humble ourselves and make things right if we can, while we can. Joseph was able to do all this because he saw and acknowledged God's plan. And he saw God's purpose for all of this. And he knew that God's plan and purpose was so much greater than anything any human can do. So have that in your heart, have that in your mind, and know that God's plan and purpose will prevail. And that will bring life. Just like Jacob's spirit is revived and all these relationships are brought to life again. This reconciliation brings freedom and renewal and unity. And you know what? Just like our sin has consequences and our sin can have a rippling effect around us, our forgiveness and reunions can have the same. in us, around us, and even into the future. I'm not saying it'll be easy. Often it isn't. It may even take time. But you are not doing this alone. Let God and His Word work in you. Life may not be what you expect it to be, or maybe it is. But regardless of where you are, what's happening, if you walk with God and remember that He is in control, and as He says in one of my favorite verses in Romans 8:28, in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. That makes all the difference. So forgive, move forward, seek reconciliation, and choose life, and let God use you to bring life to others. And let your time on earth be a glimpse into what we can look forward to in eternity. With God's help, you can do it. So may He be with you, and may you keep your eyes fixed on Him.